Mr. Vice President, Professor Bilal, the Vice President of the Republic of Tanzania, Professor Mukandala, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Dar es Salaam. May I also acknowledge Mrs. Agnes Kijazi, who is the permanent representative of Tanzania with WMO. We also have in our presence the President of Regional Association 1 of WMO, Dr. Ba. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, members of the diplomatic corps who are present here, and all other dignitaries, all protocols observed. It is indeed a pleasure for me in person to be present in Tanzania, a first visit, and I'm particularly honored to be present at this very seminal conference. Not necessarily a first of its kind, given that we have had some conferences focusing on climate, particularly hosted by the African Climate Policy Center before, but certainly a historic conference as already articulated by the choir so elegantly this morning, but also articulated by Professor Yanda in his welcoming remarks. You'll be delighted to know, of course, that WMO is fully supportive of the conference and wishes to express its appreciation to the International Steering Committee, the National Steering Committee, and all others who are involved in making this a possibility. I will later talk about these issues in relation to a message from the World Climate Research Program. There are certain things, of course, which are key to the WMO as an organization which is tasked with the responsibility by 191 member states and territories throughout the world to be custodian of and encourager and facilitator of the generation of knowledge in the areas of water, weather, and climate, with the singular purpose almost throughout life, which is saving lives and livelihoods. The role of research in support of climate services, the need for capacity development, training, and knowledge transfer, as well as the raising of the profile of climate research in Africa, will be some of the issues I will touch upon in the next few minutes. Mr. Vice President, I will apologize in advance that at some points in my talk, I may be scientific and probably, hopefully, not too technical. It is important, ladies and gentlemen, that Africa has initiatives that advance, create, and make practical use of climate research outputs, both at a global scale, regional scale, as well as a local scale. African climate variability is of fundamental importance to many other global climate phenomena which are currently the subject of research by the international research community. For example, I would include the seamless prediction challenge, and I will speak about that slightly later, but also speak of the sub-seasonal to seasonal timescales, the Med-Julian oscillation, important for intra-seasonal rainfall variability in Africa, at longer time scales, sea surface temperature fluctuations at a basin scale, important drivers of African seasonal drought and floods, and at even longer time scales, decadal ocean variability, which is a potential driver of decadal oscillations in rainfall, such as we often see in the Sahel. This research effort, of course, is aimed towards making information accessible and available to those that need it for decision makers and for decision making in general. The question then to pose is, what are climate services? And it is in this context that a number of countries, and we were delighted that Tanzania could be part of those deliberations back in 2009, to create a global framework for climate services, whose singular and intent is developing and providing information not only on the past, but the present and the future climate, on its impacts on natural and human systems, and also supporting the users of climate information at their various scales, complexity, and needs, in order to access the right products for decision making, but also to use them appropriately, including aspects of uncertainty. This is an attempt and an agreement by the world to build an operational climate service with that purpose in mind. I will not go into details on the pillars of the global framework, but just to indicate very clearly that it is driven by users, and the user interface platform is one of the key innovations in this, which is, can we generate knowledge based on the needs of users? You will see very prominently towards the bottom of the picture, research, modeling, and prediction featuring in the pillars of the GFCS. This diagram will be unraveled later on in the program, so I will not spend too much time on it, except to sort of set it as a platform for what I'm going to say next. So why is there a need for a framework for climate services? Climate services do not reach the last mile. They do not reach those that need them the most. Climate information is frequently provided in formats that are either not useful or are not readily understandable to the end user. The communication of climate services and enhanced understanding between providers and users of climate information are complex areas that also need the focus of research into the future. And therefore, the partnerships between different disciplines is absolutely key. Not just those who understand the physical climate system, but those who also understand economics, socioeconomics, and other dynamics of the human system, but also those who understand better how information may be consumed and used for decision making. Mr. Vice President, why then is the role of research so important? We have very good research outputs globally. Some of you are more familiar with the IPCC's, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, assessment reports. We have seen how they have grown over time. The latest report is 1,000 pages thick, which simply means that there is a lot of research and research outputs out there. But often this research does not move rapidly into a climate services framework where it is accessed by the most vulnerable. Such information, of course, critically depends on the availability of good quality climate observations with sufficient spatial coverage over an extended period of time. It depends on the adequacy of climate predictions, from numerical models to depict current and future regional climate. It also depends on a thorough understanding and appreciation for the uncertainties and constraints associated with the use of both data on a regional and global model scale. Even though we have these challenges, there are, of course, benefits to be accrued from climate services. A highlight would be strengthened climate services which lead to improved decisions on socioeconomic development, which help reduce disaster risks and certainly enable climate change adaptation. We have seen over time how with improved information and access to this information, the global death and death rates due to extreme events between 1900 and 2006 have reduced. Let me use a contemporary example. Cyclone Phelan over India a few days ago. Back in 1990, a similar scale storm caused the death of 10,000 people. Last week, the death toll, Mr. Vice President, was less than 10 or less than 20. Thanks to improvements in early warning systems, but also an understanding and a keenness of preparedness and a collaboration between different sectors. The energy sector, who decided to switch off some of the electricity as a precautionary measure in advance, the emergency response, and others who evacuated over 600,000 people well in advance of the storm by any means necessary. The military who came to the assistance, and also the meteorological and other services who provided critical and pivotal information well in advance of the event. I use that simply as an example of the progress made and some of the benefits we may well accrue over time. And Africa would be no different. The African continent is most vulnerable to current climate variability and extremes, and certainly is one of the most likely to suffer adverse effects of climate change. Here I'm simply showing the rainfall projections in terms of prolonged droughts both in 2004 and 2005. And this information comes from a decadal report which we published as WMO just in this past year. But talking about the challenges is not just the object of my talk. And certainly it is not the object for why we are here. We're here because we also have organizations and entities which help put this knowledge together. I will not go into detail, Mr. President, into these issues, because these will be discussed to some greater detail later on. But we have a World Climate Research Program, which is co-sponsored, as you see at the bottom there, by the International Council of Science, ICSU, the WMO, and the UNESCO's Oceans Commission, International Oceans Commission. And this program basically has defined the global research challenges, and through it, its core projects is delivering research and databases to advance, amongst other topics, climate model improvements, sub-seasonal to seasonal prediction, decadal prediction, climate change scenarios and understanding, and predictions of climate extremes, and sea level variability and change. One of the key challenges that they seek to address, or that we seek to address through this program, is basically the question of predictability. Because for use of information, it is important that it meets the user's requirement. And here, on spatial scales and also on time scales, we can see that there's a gray area where there is very low predictability. And that challenge is one that is being taken on by the World Climate Research Program and others. As an example, at a recent meeting on national drought policies, which was co-hosted by the WMO, the United Nations Convention on Desertification, and the Food and Agricultural Organization, it became clear that only one country in the world has a drought policy, in spite of drought being a common recurrence throughout the world. It is important, therefore, that all information that we generate in research does eventually make its way into operations and is accessible on a regular, predictable, and usable way. As an example, sub-seasonal to seasonal scale project. This is particularly to address the seamless prediction challenge and to close the gap, important knowledge gap on extreme weather events. But it also helps build bridges between the weather community and the climate community. And here it is important because it again addresses the gap of predictability and interactions between the weather and climate timescales, and notably the role of tropical convention. In these initiatives, the challenge of making research results useful and easily accessible to end users, such as adaptation planners and policymakers, is explicitly recognized. Mr. President, we have had success in previous initiatives. The most popular, or well, most known product is the seasonal forecasting product, which is often discussed in regional climate outlook forums. And here we must acknowledge Africa's pioneering role in establishing the Regional Climate Outlook Forum process, and Burhani Nyenzi is in the room today as one of those pivotal people who played a role there. Through coordination of these RCOFs, the regional climate organizations in Africa have unparalleled experience in condensing climate science outputs and communicating the consensus information to leading regional users and media, which would be of great value in the process of pulling future research into use. Of course, the seasonal forecast on its own is not sufficient. And as demonstrated in this slide, those that have used this information to base their food security outlook on have used it successfully, and if further improvements, of course, can only be made into the future. Mr. President, we are here to talk also about the climate of the region and the regional climate information for decision makers. Absolutely, climate models applied over a limited area can provide information on such smaller scales which would support regional impact and assessments for adaptation purposes. This is absolutely key for the continent. I skipped the slide because it is rather dense and it does have a lot of information in it, but gives you a different perspective on how the skillful use of regional climate information, such as encouraged through the Codex project, and one of the coordinators is here in this conference and will provide more detailed information during the course of the conference. But it is important that the Climate Systems Analysis Group of the University of Cape Town, which is coordinating this African effort in analysis, that these results become very important for how we make them accessible to those that need them the most. Of course, these also serve other purposes, and we were pleased to note that a gap that was identified in AR4, the assessment report, the fourth assessment report on regional information, was able to be closed due to these efforts in the fifth assessment report released a few weeks ago. All of this, though, is only possible because we also have information, data, and observations that are required. Every time I look at a map, at a global map, the African region is always exemplified by a very light fade or a very light shade of different kinds of colors on it, different from the Northern Hemisphere. We need more observations. This year, Mr. President, marks the 50th anniversary of remote sensing and space-based observations. For the WMO, it marks a special event in the creation of the World Weather Watch program. That said, adequate observations of climate are still essential, and there are still essential gaps. And here we have various programs that have been established, including the Integrated Global Observing System, WIGOS, the Global Climate Observing System, the Global Oceans Observing System, the Global Terrestrial Observing Systems. All these have been agreed by governments, which are programs aimed at coordinating the development of observational resources required throughout the world, not exclusively for, but critically important for climate research, monitoring, and prediction, and to support and enable development-related activities in Africa and elsewhere in the world. Political will is required for these investments to be made and to continue to be made. And it is sincerely hoped, and certainly my personal hope, is that the African Ministerial Conference on Meteorology, established not so long ago, will help foster and support these initiatives, and most importantly, own these investments to ensure their future sustainability and accessibility, therefore, of data and critical data and information for climate research and translation into services. I will not spend too much time on the next slide, cognizant of the time I have been given, but as I move towards the end of my talk, here's a conceptual framework which WCRP uses in coordinating climate modeling activities internationally in support of the policymaking process. And I think what is critical here, ultimately, is moving from the left-hand box, which deals with basic research, to the right-hand box, which deals with the translation into services. Mr. Vice President, ladies and gentlemen, I will skip through a few slides in the interest of time, but these, I'm told, will be made accessible to all of you, so you might have a view of what I have missed. If I may move one back, just to highlight that there is still a gap for capacity building efforts to bring us up to speed. WCRP sponsored students and early career scientists in the last 2 years. You would see that Africa has not featured too highly. For a continent of its size, with a population of its size, and certainly in the academic community. More can be done, and hopefully part of this process in this conference is to see how best we address that. WMO, of course, is not acting alone in trying to bring information to the world and to all decision makers. A new initiative, which was recently launched in Rio +20, is the Future Earth, which is an innovative and creative attempt to address sustainability challenges into the future. And here, WCRP and this climate community gathered here will make a very important contribution to Future Earth in the way that we are organized now, in particular to address our global understanding of environmental changes that we live with. It is a unique partnership between science organizations like the Council of Science, the Social Sciences Council is there, and others who traditionally would not have worked together, but have seen the need to come together and work together to addressing this pressing challenge of the 21st century. Mr. Vice President, let me conclude, because I was told that I should also say a few words on behalf of the WCRP Director. This conference is very important. Professor Yanda, you've already acknowledged the contributors. If you look at the back of your registration tag, all the sponsors and co-sponsors are listed. And so without going through that alphabet soup, I would rather just acknowledge your contribution. Again, Professor Arametal and Professor Dr. Bekele, let me acknowledge your contribution to making this possible, and the members of the JSC, or the Joint Steering Committee of the WCRP, who are present here. Your contribution has been key. These has been discussions over many years. In Beijing, which touched sides on this conference. In Addis, we have touched sides on the conference. At the Open Science Conference held in the US, some discussion were held. And so all of you can be proud that this day is a possibility and that everyone who is in the room has come as a result of your efforts and as your invitation. But like all things, these are just enabling mechanisms. The conference is an enabling mechanism, which needs to have outputs that need to be followed up. And so as a challenge to the conference, there really are three key things. One is, can we have a sense of what this network is and how it may be continued and sustained? But you only sustain organizations because there is something for them to do. And here it may be well important that what we will hear over the next 4 days are a complexity of things that people are doing. How can we agree and arrive at a few sets of priorities, maybe not more than 5, that need to be pursued by this collective over the next 5 to 10 years that can help advance our understanding of the regional climate over Africa. But most important, are sufficiently appealing and critical messages that can bring the interest of the funders and the interest of the African Ministerial Conference on Meteorology and other political leaders to help sustain this effort in support. Of course, I should also acknowledge the role of the African Union, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. For this conference will be followed next week by another conference in Addis Ababa, which brings together policymakers and also climate scientists, with the view for preparing for COP19 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, amongst other issues. And so these efforts are all to be commended as they help advance the continent and making sure that it plays its rightful and pivotal role in our understanding of our ever-changing environment, and that African scholars can also stand proud in their contribution to this global effort. Mr. Vice President, I appreciate very much your invitation and certainly wish the conference great success over the next few days, and wish you too I'm slightly belated because yesterday was a very important day in the calendar of Tanzania, and as a young activist from many years ago, the words of Julius Nyerere were always very inspirational. And so I wish you well and congratulate you again on excellent celebrations and hosting this event.